What else am I supposed to say? Oh yeah, this is a Jason Billy beat, bitches.
Crank these nuts, 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 crank these nuts.
Hating is a bad disease, so why you gotta hate on me? So I suggest you keep the peace and keep it moving in the street, cause I'ma keep on doing me regardless what a hater think. You ain't no concern to me, cause you ain't trying to earn with me. A real go-getter, I'm out for the dough, nigga. Making my pocket bigger, I ain't gotta squeeze a trigger. Nicks, dimes, quarters, no drugs, I make sense. Them dollars is stacked too, your money's all spent before it's even made. Homes, that's why you even hating. Homes a bad chick around me, similar to K. Jones. Damn right, I make moves 24/7 with the chick that's fine as hell that goes by the name Heaven. Beat legend, LSP, a grand hustle like TIP, RESPECT, or else you gonna see me. Now I take it back, you can't see me with binoculars. Unstoppable, so no need in trying to block on us. You lames don't rock like us, you ain't on top like us. Platinum style, bright boy, shining like a light boy. Everybody gotta dance, how can I keep up? Crank this, crank that, you can crank these nuts.
Crank these nuts, 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 crank these nuts.
You can do it anywhere, do my dance. Crank these nuts, crank these nuts. In the street or in the club, crank these nuts. Crank these nuts, crank these nuts. Now beam it out, now beam it out, now beam it out, now beam it out. K. Jones with it, K. Jones with it, K. Jones with it, now beam it out.
Crank these nuts, 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 crank these nuts.
It's your boy J Billy, like one more again. In club level, drunk off that gin. On the dance floor, I got that do it. Watch me get 'em hype, girl, put your back into it. Bust that Nikkei out and finish with Janaya. I'm heating up the stage, the crowd is on fire. Now watch me do the Jason beat. How you gon' finish up? Stand back, hold up, watch me crank these nuts.
Crank these nuts, 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 crank these nuts.